Lasha, according to the Georgian Chronicles, means illuminator of the world. An impressive middle name for a monarch, to say the least, but a mouthful at that. If we break down that word to its simplest form, it means bright, glittering, standing out, all of the above and a bit more. It's a light entirely of its own making, and unforgivably so. King George IV Lasha Bagration was born as the brightest child in an age of gold. His destiny was to be the king his mother Tamar Mepe physically could not. He was to be Georgia's most powerful king of all time, and possibly the most powerful King George into, well, the other British Georgian era. Lasha was to take this Georgian golden age, shine his radiant light upon it, and consecrate it onto a whole nother level. With all these high hopes, no one would have guessed that the man born would end up being something completely different. Not evil in his character, in the slightest, nor was he entirely made of the same moral fabric of his mother. George Lasha would end up being the king no one expected or wanted, but when the moment came, George's brightest quality would shine through. He was the bravest man in any room, and should remain a hero because of that. George IV Lasha Bagration was born in 1192, a birth so acclaimed that it is still celebrated to this day. Overlooking the Georgian capital sits the village of Tbilisi. In this place where Lasha was born, Saint King Tamar's Day is still celebrated here every May 14th. Of course, this golden child still gets his own birthday. Tamar Mepe had recently started to carve out her empire with the help of her second husband, the boy's father, David Soslan. From birth, George would inherit the Bagration crown jewels from his mother, while his father, as Prince of Alania, would provide him with notoriety among the many different people of the northern Caucasus. His own second name, like David and his Soslan, appears an Alanian custom, not so much a Carvelian one. Let's be real here, though. The blood of Georgian kings was so mixed now with Alania, they might as well have just been the same family. Only 2 years after his birth, Tamar the Great would go into labor a second time, this time giving birth to a girl, Rusidan, named after her own aunt. These two new additions would conclude this generation's Bagration royal family, one boy and one girl. Lasha and Rusidan couldn't have been born to a better set of monarchs in the Middle Ages. Unlike Tamar's first marriage, she had married Soslan for love. They were cousins and had known each other for most of their lives. From all accounts, they adored their children the same, and with the zenith of the Georgian Golden Age taking up their youth, they could also afford for them everything and nearly anything. Something that might just prove to have long-lasting impacts on both of the siblings. Despite this medieval parenting advice I have absolutely no right to give, George Lasha was given a fine education and would turn out to be a pretty smart fella, having knowledge of many subjects and a conversationalist with that. As the Radiant Prince grew up, his tutor sessions were added after his combat classes, mace being his preferred weapon of choice. Even yet, he showed the typical Bagration brain for generalship, and exceeded in the complementary skill of leadership. But what George Lasha loved most of all was an Alanian classic, a good sturdy bow, a few arrows, and a nice horse to gallop on. That's right, George Lasha was a damn good horse archer, and while perhaps living a bit too lavishly to call him a proper Mongol, Lasha could match his skill on a horse and bow with his exceptional strength. Physically, he was strong and every bit a king. Mentally, he was smart and showed promise. Lasha was becoming the prince everyone thought he would be, and out proving that more. While George grew up in the empire he would one day rule over, it filled out alongside him. A handful of times, he was even left in Tbilisi as the senior Bagration, as Tamar sometimes accompanied the army. It wasn't long after one of these campaigns that David Soslan, having won a great victory against the Seljuks, would meet his end, likely dying rather young in 1207. Not very long after this, the now 15-year-old Prince George suddenly became a king. Well, he was a junior king to Tamar Mepe. His new role was his final training ground between himself and the throne. In these awkward teenage years, it's probably hard being king, so Tamar entrusted her choice general, Ivan Zakarian, as George Lasha's personal tutor. A good enough general to learn from, sure, but there were probably a whole bunch of, "You are my fucking dads" at the beginning or something like that, which would end up to sour the king's relationship with his most powerful and trusted nobleman. But Ivan did not care what that little king thought of him. He was loyal to Tamar, owed her his life, and pledged to protect her son's life. Something that would prove to be way harder than any one man could imagine. Finally, to give the young king experience on the administrative front, George was placed in charge of the province of Javakia. Lasha passed these tests with flying colors too, gaining the love and respect of the native Javakians along the way. The Javakians themselves were one of the oldest Kartvelian groups with their own unique dialect, a people whose respect is earned and not necessarily given. And what they called him was Lord of the Javakians, so he was obviously adored here as well. Away from the capital at last, the young king formed his own circle of local noble friends that would end up being his lifelong advisors and allies. To name a few of the most important, the Achilles brothers, Ivan and Shalva, the latter of which would be appointed Master of Ceremonies and Court Treasurer in 1212, likely a joint decision between Tamar and George. Then there's Tamar's total fanboy, Sargas Tamogveli, the guy who literally wrote fanfics for Tamar Mepe, of course found himself firmly in the corner of her son. A little weird. Bringing with him his own son, the not-so-Georgian named Taki ad-Din, bringing his martial expertise to complement his father's more poetic nature. On the other end of the spectrum, being away from home meant that George could befriend some characters that his mother most definitely would not approve of him hanging around. Another set of brothers, Menma and Batso Jakeli, the former rulers of Javakheti and one of the most notable noble families, all before they had disobeyed Tamar so much that she took away their lordly fiefs and handed most of them over to their own more loyal cousin. It can be no mystery why the Jakeli brothers befriended the young king. They hoped he would restore their dishonored family. And so, for 7 years, the so-called Lord of the Javakians was supposed to learn how to govern a realm. But here is where George's worst quality may just come from. All these important Javakians were more than willing to govern on his behalf and advise him every step of the way. George learned how to rule and give orders. But he never truly learned or found much interest in the mundanity of governing. It had been some time that Tamar contracted some form of long-term illness, perhaps cancer. As she grew weaker, young King George was given more responsibilities, and by 1213, his mother was on her deathbed. She died in January of that year, and so King George Lasha IV was crowned at the age of 21. He was awarded what stands as the greatest land inheritance for any Georgian ruler. He appeared every bit a promising, strong-willed lord, king, and emperor, but he still had to convince the peripheries of his empire that. In what would become his usual head-first manner for his first act as king, George called a Darbazi and demanded tribute from all of the empire's many vassals. It's a miracle everyone paid the first time when they were asked to do so. Well, they did have to wait a bit longer for their most distant vassal, the Azerbaijani Atabeg, whose ancestors have fought Georges for nearly 100 years. Atabeg Uzbek sure was late because he never planned on paying and silently declared his independence, and then rather loudly took the city fortresses of Aran and Ganja that lay at the heart of the empire. There was only one thing that King George could do in these formative years as monarch. He gathered an army and entrusted his mentor, and the second most powerful man in Georgia, to march on Ganja and force Uzbek back into submission. George remained in Tbilisi for a short time before joining the army after they had already begun the siege of Ganja, a city David IV of Georgia, reputed as the sword of the Messiah, could not even take himself. George was a talented general and a fearless warrior, and had just enough delusions of grandeur to attempt something so brave that it was downright stupid. Here we come to our first power struggle between the level-headed, much older Ivan Zakarian, who was practically the hand of the king, with his role as Atabeg, and the overly self-confident young warrior king. What is a student to a teacher? What is a king to a tutor? Ivan was general of the army. George wanted a full frontal assault. Ivan and a majority of the other officers rejected the king's plan, which would result in the death of thousands of their own. As the siege dragged on for weeks, a level of animosity grew in the war camp. As it was divided in two, the Javakians and the other Georgian portions of the army began siding with their king's plan, while the Armenians and the senior generals knew better than throwing their own men at these particular walls. The king had had enough, though. Without warning, using his personal gift of speech, he inspired 4,000 men to follow him to victory or death. Not wanting Ivan to claim any of this said glory, the king took his army to the complete opposite side of the city's long walls. But he had made one slight miscalculation. Inside Ganja was an army of 10,000. Like George, the garrison had no hesitation, sallying out of the fort to meet the now helpless and stranded king. A clash ensued just outside the walls. Here, King George got his first real taste of combat, and it was an utter bloodbath. Although completely outnumbered, 1,000 of these 4,000 were made up of the king's personal Manaspa bodyguard. And it was only because they were present that the Georgians, after a long slogfest, finally won a Pyrrhic victory. The costs were exceptional. Over half of the 4,000 George had brought with him were laying dead, with even more enemies arrayed in their midst. For all that was lost, nothing was gained. The remaining garrison made it back to the fortress, and the siege continued as it had previously, much to the frustration of George and Ivan. The city stood, as did the siege camp, for some time before Ganja ran out of food, and Atabeg Uzbek surrendered and agreed to return to the Georgian Empire as a tribute-paying vassal. On a total side note, Atabeg Uzbek, who would prove to be the last of the Eldeguzids, would end up marrying the daughter of the last Seljuk Sultan. That just goes to show how fast dynasties were rising and falling in this part of the world at this time. The siege was won. No thanks at all to King George, who only served to kill more hungry bellies inside the walls of Ganja. After returning to Tbilisi, the army officers and nobles assembled. Here, King George was made to apologize personally to all of them. Of course, Ivan Zakarian was behind this, personally scolding the young but now adult king in front of the country's leading men. King George could have reacted differently here, much angrier, but deep down he knew that he had messed up royally, and he likely hated to say it, but he needed Ivan. He needed Ivan, that old bastard. Regardless of this embarrassment, George was still alive and well. It's better for a young king to learn these lessons early, lest he remain a young king forever. After apologizing to his entire nobility, many of the nobles lost their faith in their king's foolish actions, while his Javakian friends only drew his circle smaller. After concluding the campaign for Ganja and the pity party that followed, King George made a wise choice to strengthen his vassals' conviction in him by going on an empire-wide tour. First, he went north and actually managed to help convert many of the locals to Georgian Orthodoxy, his Elenian middle name and perhaps his temperament finally suiting the peoples of the North Caucasus. And then he went west to his father's homeland of Alania, and then through Abkhazia before returning to Tbilisi, a pit stop on his way to departing for the eastern half of his empire. The dude literally only made it to the first Kakhetian village when he fell head over heels in love with a local peasant girl. There was already a few things wrong with this. Kings have married for love before in history, but usually not without some drama involved. The main problem with this particular case was that the unnamed peasant woman in question was already married. At any rate, George did what any sensible young man with the world at his fingertips would do. He fucked her, failed to annul her marriage, concluded his empire-wide tour, brought her back to sit next to him in court, and told everyone that she was his wife. I'll say this one last time. It's better a king make these mistakes when he was young. It's not totally uncommon for a king to have a mistress, but it sure is highly frowned upon when it's another man's wife. But at least she wasn't pregnant. The Bagrationi royal family had just started to get over their succession crisis caused by bastards and second-born sons. Now that would be a real problem. It didn't take long for the peasant queen to start showing. I can just see Ivan Zakarian just sitting there at an office late at night, eyes glazed over from no sleep with dark bags, at his desk, running the country for George when he was told about the pregnancy. The dude probably just slammed his head right on the desk. Again, the contrast and the mutual respect these two have with each other while loving and hating one another, it's like an annoying babysitter kind of trope or something. When the child was born a boy, a firstborn male bastard could cause some real problems in about 20 years or so. Ivan probably wished he would have just been executed already. They would name him David, after so many of George's ancestors before him. The church had been rather lax on the whole situation that the peasant woman was married by a wholly ordained member of the church, but when David was born, the church finally did step in. The Patriarch of Georgia informed the king that he had to return the peasant woman, back to her actual husband. This lady literally lived a queen's life for a year, gave birth to a future king, and then she just fell off the historical record, never heard from again. A compromise was made to keep the bastard boy close, and she was handed to George's sister Rusidan, who would raise him. King George made no such compromises. In a final fuck you to all those who simply didn't let the king do what he wanted, he promised he would never marry again and by extension would never have a legitimate heir, seeking his only son to succeed him. He wanted the final say, and he would get it, never having another child. Having turned half his nobility and the entire church against him in only 2 years, George gathered his Javakian friends and went on a Henry VIII level of partying and feasting and fucking. Although his opposite on the marriage level, George went on a near endless streak of hunting and drinking with the boys, no longer attending many state matters unless the issue was pressing. He would show all of these old heads trying to tell him what to do all the time, all with his inaction. But to be honest, if I was in George's shoes, I would probably be pissed too. I've never seen a king so confident, but just gets his wings clipped and embarrassed all the time. It's just fucking sad. While George was being an utter heathen, a new and powerful enemy entered the Georgian sphere of influence at the usual spot. The usual suspect, the Aldeguzids, submitted to becoming vassals of the now massive Khwarezmian Empire, led by Shah Muhammad II, otherwise known as the Second Alexander the Great. Which was kinda true. He was conquering Iran, but from the opposite direction. He may have just reached Greece too if it wasn't for his untimely end. Like a true Robert Baratheon, King George only put his wine down when it was time to kill something. The king came out of his self-imposed isolation and gathered an army of his own, so no one else could tell him what to do with it. Atabeg Uzbek, caught in the middle of two superpowers, warned that he would call up Alexander II if George tried to reconquer Azerbaijan. A bit older, and a bit wiser now, George took a moment to ponder his options. Just kidding, he didn't give a shit what Uzbek said. He simply captured him and reinstated him as his own vassal now for the second time. Shah Muhammad II was gathering a massive army in preparation to meet the Georgians for more than just what was left of Uzbek's lands, I'm certain. But the Khwarezmian Empire was so vast that it took some time to gather a large enough force to match that of the neighboring empire. George prepared as well, ready to cement his name in history by slaying Alexander II, I'm sure. But that would-be epic meeting never happened. An invasion from the east forced Shah Muhammad back to his capital in a hurry. But the Khwarezmians would be back in due time. Now, with an army just standing around and kicking rocks, George went on a power show to confirm his southern vassals' loyalty. They had paid tribute, but for some reason, after Uzbek was traded around like a hot potato, the tribute came late from Erzurum, Nakhchivan, and Kalat. The latter was the only one to resist, likely expecting the Khwarezmians to still invade. King George had no problem taking back Lake Van that Kalat rested on. For all George was or wasn't worth, he managed to keep Tamar's empire held together. All of his vassals knew that if they did not pay that yearly tribute, the king himself was coming for you quickly and without regard for his own safety or anyone else's. And yeah, that's effective. While on the outside, Georgia was still the military powerhouse it had been for nearly a century at this point. On the inside, the economy was crippling under its own weight. The military spending was obvious, but this was well accounted for and should not be the main reason for a weakening economy. So what is it? The Golden Age simply got too golden. In the latter half of George's reign, post 1215, the Georgian Empire went into a steady period of inflation, as demonstrated by this fucked up coin, which they didn't bother to smelt back down, or is this a decoration? I don't know. The Empire's economy on paper should have been strong. The Caucasus had all sorts of mining operations, the trade routes it sat on, not to mention the Silk Roads, were well traveled, and with the ports on the Black Sea bustling, everything should have been fine. Now let's talk about the obvious. The military we already went over. Then there's your complacent warrior party King George, which definitely did not help, but did he seriously spend that much money just to get back at his courtly rivals? I doubt it, because he still wanted his bastard son to rule after him. Then there's all these aforementioned mines. More gold means more coins, means more inflation, means higher prices on everything, means baptisms costing more than 100 coins? Seriously, that's like some 95 thesis prices for a water dunk. That just goes to show how truly bad the issue was. A theory I also have is the many different competing mercantilely inclined ethnic groups inside the Georgian Empire, over or undervaluing the products that pass through their lands. There is also the economic fact that we have to consider. More wealth, 100% of the time, at least for countries, means more corruption. But who can be blamed for this? Our first and most obvious suspect is Ivan Zakharia, but I really don't see him doing that, even though it would be easiest for him to do so. He seems morally incorruptible, and Tamar trusted him fully, so honestly, that's enough for me. Then there's the church, which are notorious beds of corruption, and now that they hate George, why wouldn't they profit from his coffers? This I do find likely. The main suspect, or should I say suspects, I find are King George's closest friends. The Lord of the Javakians was always loyal to them, and being friends with a drunk bro king means you can use him. My vote goes to the two disinherited Jekeli brothers, Batso and Menma, but they probably all did it. Besides that fanfic making Sargis Tamagveli, that is, he's a real one. Another reason emerged much later that only served to heighten the problem. There was a major trade disruption in the east. Unknown origins, but whispers found their way across the Silk Road. For a brief time in Tamar and George's life, the Georgian Empire may have just been one of the greatest places to live in the world from an economic standpoint. Now it was starting to turn into a backwater. Let's move on to the buildings that King George sponsored. The largest church was this one. Yeah, I mean, it's nice, but compared to most of his ancestors, this was a frickin' mud hut. But Khazrati Monastery still stands, well preserved at that. It must have been well built. Speaking of churches, that big one in Rome with that silly little bishop who always writes to the Georgians promising them the world if they would just help them with that small little thing called the Crusades. King David IV nearly joined the Crusades after the first one, but died before he had a chance to do so. The Pope wrote to George and asked him to join the Fifth Crusade. Of course, George Lasha jumped on this opportunity and began preparations immediately. And I do mean extensive preparations, for over a year, gathering everything he would need to finally join his Christian brothers from the west, potentially even meaning to take Tamar's body with him to Jerusalem for burial. They were just about to leave when a mystery invader came from the east. Lasha was forced to turn his massive army around, which he was damn lucky to assemble in time. As confident as he ever was, with more men behind him than ever before, George neared closer to the threat when he heard Shah Muhammad II, a man regarded as the second Alexander the Great, was now running like King Darius. It was only a few years ago that a strange group of emissaries with a caravan of spoils from the Far East arrived at the court of the Khwarezmian Shah. They were only in Iran to request peaceful trade relations and trade some gifts. Shah Muhammad did not take them or their so-called Great Khan in any seriousness. Surely the steppe could not be united. So he had the lot of them executed and all of their goods seized. Little did Shah Muhammad know that he had just pissed off the up-and-coming, soon-to-be most powerful empire in the world. And the Mongols always paid revenge back tenfold. Soon enough, just as the Shah and his neighboring king of Georgia were about to come to blows over a border conflict, the Mongols struck suddenly and without regard for life or morality. Possibly hundreds of thousands of Mongolian horse archers flooded into the Khwarezmian Empire, Chinese siege engines, likely the greatest in the world at this point, following just behind them. They turned some of the most prosperous cities in the world to ghost towns. Eventually, they hit the capital, Originz, and utterly exterminated it. Atrocities of war that go unmatched. Shah Muhammad could do nothing but run. He ran and ran until he could simply run no more. The Mongol horses that could seemingly mount the world had one weakness: water. And the salty, undrinkable Caspian Sea was the perfect shield from this wave of terror. The Shah boarded a ship and found a new home on a small island just off the shore. He had escaped the Mongols. He had lived. But conditions on this island were harsh when compared to the naturally air-conditioned palaces of inner Iran. Soon enough, infection had set in. His lungs grew heavy, his breath short, and his heart fast. Shah Muhammad died on that little island. Nearly any hope of restoring the once vast and mighty Khwarezmian Empire died with him. For the sake of driving out these horse lords, the fishermen on that little Caspian island stayed hush on the fate of the Shah, the secret being kept for some time in hopes of restoring the empire under his own son. The notorious Jalal al-Din continued the fight against the Mongols, forced to campaign in the Far East near India as his last holdout. Chinggis Khan personally sent two of his most trusted commanders and 20,000 horse archers to locate and bring back Shah Muhammad, dead or alive. Without knowing his fate, these generals began looking east. They heard of a powerful country of mountains made from gold and wine, led by a young king whose might needs no question. Perhaps Shah Muhammad was here. Perhaps he wasn't. The Mongols did not care. The Empire of Georgia was found guilty of being rich and found themselves allies of the Mongols' greatest rival on the steppe. The once all-powerful Cuman Kipchaks and Georgians together were unstoppable, maybe even for the Mongols. And they had been allies for at least 100 years now. Here, with this knowledge afforded to the Mongols by their extensive spy network that couldn't find Shah Muhammad, the Mongolian mastermind of warfare himself, perhaps a greater tactician than Chinggis Khan himself, devised a plan so crazy, so extensive, that only he could lead it, and only with one of Mongolia's finest warriors beside him. Subutai and Jebe were the two aforementioned dogs of war, and after careful analysis, they had more plans than just finding the Shah. They requested Chinggis Khan if they could lead a reconnaissance, quotations, reconnaissance mission across the Caucasus, through the Kingdom of Georgia and into the steppe, with the long goal of opening a new front against the Cuman Kipchak Confederation and ending their alliance to Georgia. Chinggis granted these two permission, knowing the massive risk, but also coherent to the fact that if anyone could lead and complete this daring and downright insane plan, it was Subutai and Jebe alone. To start with, Jebe, which translates to arrow, earned that nickname because he shot Chinggis Khan. Yeah, he shot him with an arrow, and he almost killed him. But instead of executing him, Chinggis saw only potential and hired him on the spot. From here, Jebe quickly rose through the ranks and became the youngest main general in the Mongol army. Jebe was renowned for his ability to lead men on the front lines. That was his role. And obviously his accuracy on horseback didn't leave him with a nickname for nothing. Jebe was the general you trusted in the trenches to fight his way out. Then on the equally menacing but far more well-rounded side was Subutai, Chinggis Khan's most senior general, who quite possibly was a better strategic mind than the great Khan himself. Subutai ran every aspect of the military with hawk-eyed efficiency, so confident in his logistical expertise that he was willing to cross the expanse of the Caucasus Mountains without a full map. Subutai was to Genghis Khan what Davout was to Napoleon, Antony to Caesar, what Ivan Zakarian currently was to King George Lasha of Georgia. And so, in the fall of 1220, the reconnaissance mission that would go on to be called the Great Raid began, as 20,000 Mongols crossed the border through the lush grasslands of Armenia. With enough fodder to feed their herd, these dogs of war started looting nearby villages, testing to see if this particular king would come to the rescue. Meanwhile, in the Georgian capital of Tbilisi, King George IV Lasha Bagrationi was assembling a massive army, not meant for the East or the Mongols, but one that would finally march to join the Georgian Christians with their longtime Crusader allies. Yes, the Georgians were about to join the Crusades. But with this alternate history ruined by the Mongols, let's go over exactly what King George may or may not have known about them. The answer is, I don't think he knew enough. Let's not forget about George's own spy network. The Mistovarni, set up by King David IV, was still running, but was obviously complacent or fed some horrible lies. Personally, I don't believe what I'm going to tell you, but I'm going to tell you. Word got out that the Mongols were actually long-lost Nestorian Christians who were here to save Georgia and restore the Christian East, joining the Crusaders along with George Lasha. I mean, they did just crush the greatest Muslim powerhouse in the world at that point in the Khwarezmian Empire. There is some truth in this seemingly otherworldly statement. The Mongols were Christians. I mean, not wholly, obviously, but there were whole tribes of Mongols that were Christians, and I just can't wrap my head around that. And even yet, some were in the Mongolian military high command. Perhaps Mongol spies fed into this, and the Mistovarni got the wrong idea. Prester John was here, and his name was Genghis Khan. The Mongols weren't invaders. They were saviors. But sure, the Mongols, open as they were not afraid to use religion as a weapon or a shield. And with the Georgians being the religious bunch that they were and still are, he might have just tricked them. What we know that King George knew, at the very least, is that a mystery army, all on horseback, was raiding southeast Armenia. And that did not fly with him. King George Lasha, alongside his childhood tutor and chief officer, Ivan Zakarian, decided to go on their own reconnaissance mission. At this point, the raids in Armenia were so small that King George decided to send some of his massive army back to Tbilisi. Now, with only 10,000 of George's finest, this makes me think that he really had no idea what he was up against. Atabeg Uzbek, one of George's senior governors who never really was loyal to him, knew the kind of people he was dealing with as the Mongols passed through his lands, and he simply retreated west toward his son's hold in Nakhchivan. They plundered modern-day Armenia and Azerbaijan, growing in frequency and ferocity. While most Mongol conquests started with a warm and friendly surrender, or I'll kill everybody, they still offered that surrender as a kindness. No kindness was afforded to Georgia. This was no conquest after all. This was a reconnaissance. Or in other words, the rules didn't apply here. The raids featured babies torn from mothers' bellies, among all that couldn't be worse than that. All this in an effort to anger the short-tempered king into fierce action. While King George likely knew very little about the Mongols, Subutai knew all about him and his empire. He was a man that studied before doing his homework, and he liked to play with his food. He knew George wouldn't let his own people be picked apart by the birds. He knew the weaknesses of the Georgian Empire, its enemies outside and inside. The only thing he did not know was how the Georgian military operated. The Mongols at this point hadn't fought anything of the like before. First of all, this was the Mongol Empire's first invasion of a Christian nation, and these most pious ones were filled with a crusader zeal and really always had that same zeal even before the Crusades started. The Khwarezmians might have been the closest thing, but the Georgian infantry combined with Armenian arrows was a different beast in itself. A stubborn one that found help from various horsemen from their Elenian cousins to Kipchak mercenaries, Circassians, and all the others. There was only one way to test this king, his tutor, and his army. Subutai and Jebe set their trap, and now George and Ivan were walking straight into it. The armies of Georgia stopped a few raids, killed a few of these foes. When they were pushed back, George made the decision to run them out of the country once and for all. Here on the edge of his empire, in the not-so-vast but still extensive arid grasslands of Armenia, Subutai and Jebe introduced George and Ivan to the most used and most effective strategy up the Mongolian war sleeve. As the Georgians gave chase, the Mongols began hit-and-run feigned retreat tactics. God damn it. George, the stubborn king that he was, pushed on, but was soon convinced to retreat himself, perhaps realizing that these men could simply run forever. As he retreated, Subutai really tested the Georgians, and they held their own, with the Mongols taking more than a few casualties from the Kartvelian arrows. Eventually, the battered Georgians made it back to the safety of the mountains provided by the Lesser Caucasus. The Mongols turned back, only to set up camp for winter pastures around the city of Erin, which was near the center of the Georgian Empire and uncomfortably close to Tbilisi. In that great city of the Caucasus was the would-be Crusader army turned Mongolian defense force. King George and Ivan Zakarian went to the drawing board, deciding to hunker down in the capital and recover for the time being. Surely these horsemen couldn't make war in winter. It's not like they were from Siberia or something. And they can't besiege a city like Tbilisi without some infantry at least. While never truly idle for long, Subutai did what he did best in foreign lands. He simply made a mess of the place. He made allies with the empire's own vassal subjects. Of course, Atabeg Uzbek flipped sides, but for once in his life, he may have resisted this if not for his own son, the governor of Nakhchivan, who submitted to Mongol rule. With these two Aldeguzids went many of the Turkish peoples who had integrated into the Georgian Empire, suddenly rejoining their nomadic brethren. And then the Mongols found a friend in the empire's Kurdish subjects, which were numerous. With a proper infantry force at their side, Subutai began a surprise march through the mountains of the Caucasus in January. Here they took the lax Georgian garrisons by surprise and picked them off in the January wind. Not only were they ambushing, but they were moving fast. Reconnaissance work paying off, they made it through the maze of drifted mountain passes, and by spring, they were well on their way to Tbilisi. Subutai knew exactly what he was doing, yet again, testing the young King George. King George knew what had to be done more than anyone else in the room. No matter what, if Tbilisi were to not be burned like Khwarezm's capital, those traitorous infantry had to go. King George and his trusted mentor led the men who, at this point, were fighting to save the Crusaders in the Levant out of their ancient capital and toward the Mongolian coalition. They met at the Battle of Sagimi. The Georgians outnumbered their foe, but not by much. Here, they blocked the way to Tbilisi, unmoving, as if they were the walls. The Kurdish and Turkish infantry advanced first, with the Mongols closely behind. As the infantry and cavalry on both sides clashed, the heavily armored Kartvelian infantry made mincemeat, reminding the traitors why they were under the Georgian boot in the first place. The coalition center line broke, man and horse now tucking tail and running. This was their chance to finally catch those damn horse archers. They caught up to them, got a few of them, but eventually, somehow the Mongols regrouped, turned around, and simply let the arrows fly at the disorganized Georgians. Feigned retreat. Got him again. Targeting the cavalry first before closing the flanks and raining down hell on all of them. The king ordered for a retreat, with his bodyguard filling around him, but much of the army was surrounded, deserted, and left for dead in a field of arrows. The defeat was severe. The army was in tatters and needed rebuilt. But King George had done exactly just enough. He had slaughtered the enemy infantry enough to dissuade the Mongols from Tbilisi, this time around at least. Subutai and Jebe turned around, minimal casualties, with not one but two different armies that had potential to block the Mongol army in the passes of the Caucasus. They had killed two birds with one stone, and returned to greener pastures in modern-day Azerbaijan. Like in Aran, the Mongols chose to winter 1221 near modern-day Barda, raiding Shirvan in the meantime. Here, Subutai, who had resisted from targeting large population centers, began offering the cities of Iran, formerly part of the Khwarezmian Empire, the classic, surrender or you all die. He moved up from there until reaching Ardabil and Ganja, cities of the Georgian Empire, who both refused to surrender. Ganja, the city that was a thorn in the side to many a king of Georgia, was sacked in record time, along with Ardabil. The Mongolian reconnaissance force, while perfectly fine still, had lost quite a few men since the start of their great raid nearly 3 years ago. Genghis Khan replenished their 20,000, and with the loot they had already captured and with the promising victory outside Tbilisi, the Great Khan gifted his dogs of war another 10,000 on top of that. Great. 1221 rolled into 1222, and the Mongols emerged from Barda and marched straight toward Tbilisi yet again. Ivan and George, as one last shot, showed the Mongols something they may have never seen before. If these light cavalry could meet only a few thousand of Georgia's equivalent to the medieval knight, the cataphracts would slaughter them. At the Battle of Kunan, the Mongols boldly and rather out of character charged the infantry out the gate. They held their ground, and the cataphracts, who were a large part of this army, charged and dealt heavy casualties. Then, the Mongols, you guessed it, they retreated. The cataphracts chased them. God damn it, the cataphracts chased them until they were lured toward a nearby forest where 10,000 hidden Mongols, those extra provided by Genghis Khan and unaccounted for by the Georgians, emerged. 5,000 circled the cataphracts with Subutai, while 5,000 circled the infantry who were simply sitting ducks. As the arrows knocked, recurved bows and strings sang, chaos ensued. King George himself, as more than half an Elanian, was a horse archer, and a damn good one at that trade. But these 5,000 approaching him now were all just as good as him, if not better. George would learn the true power of this deadly combination as the irony hit him square in the chest. In the heat of the slaughter, an arrow found its way through King George Lasha's bright armor, perhaps one from Jebe himself, as it somehow did not kill the king on the spot, even though it had lodged itself in his chest. In utter horror, Ivan Zakarian watched as the kid who he had helped become king and still helped, and whose life he was supposed to protect by law and by promise to his mother, was helplessly wounded. He called the retreat, and without him there, I'm not sure anyone, king included, would have made it back to Tbilisi. A large part of the infantry and the entire heavy cavalry force were deserted to save the king and stragglers. Somehow Ivan and George both made it back. In his greatest effort yet, he had once again saved the young King George's life, at least for the time being. The arrow was taken out. The king was in pain, but he did not bleed out. King George was a man of immense strength. He could take an arrow to the chest, perhaps better than the average man. But this was still an arrow wound, chest likely blown open to some degree, in the year 1222. Yeah, the royal doctors were gonna have a handful, or their hands in him, and festering his wounds. But then a miracle happened. King George actually started to recover. A Bagration is hard to kill, unless you have poison. After King George had taken an arrow for his country, these men from the east, these horsemen, these barbarians who killed without mercy or care, simply left. Yeah, that's right. After Subutai had dismantled an empire that had been built through 2 centuries of rich history, in literally 3 years, he just fucking left. He shot their king. He did a drive-by. He shot King George and he left. Georgia was on its knees. still managing to hold itself together, but with 2 armies wiped out in 2 years. They were practically helpless. Probably preparing to meet the Savans high up in the safety of their mountains. All Subutai wanted was the ability to freely pass through the Caucasus without threat, and he only had to exterminate a few armies to get what he asked for. When the reconnaissance in this mission actually started becoming a reconnaissance and not a massacre, Subutai hired the wrong local to tell him where he was going. This one guy probably caused more casualties to the Mongolian army than the Georgians did themselves. But who knows? This random guy led the Mongols through the interior of the Caucasus and just left them stranded there. No map, nothing. When the Mongols finally emerged on the other side of the Greater Caucasus, after months, demoralized and hungry, another army waited for them. 2 of Georgia's most trusted vassals, Alania and Circassia, would join forces with Cuban Kipchaks, among others. This coalition army was one born from the steppe, not unlike their tired opponent. But it didn't matter. Subutai and Jebe beat this coalition as well, perhaps the last real chance the world had to stop the early Mongol conquest evaporated. The Mongols kept going north, towards the lands of the Rus, far enough away for Georgia to finally put its guard down. The eastern part of the empire was thoroughly looted up to Tbilisi, and currently revolting, while the western half did remain unmanned, but untouched. The Georgian Empire was not dead yet. Neither was their king. There was still time to rebuild, just as the Georgians had done so many times before. And that's exactly when the Cuman Kipchaks, or what was left of them, invaded, breaking their near 100-year alliance. In reality, the Cumans were thrown to the wind. While some settled in Georgia, as they had before, others in Hungary and beyond that, this particular group decided to mop up Mongolian leftovers in Georgia. With the king still well into his recovery, Ivan Zakarian was given a solo mission to find these rogue Kipchaks, and at the very least, drive them from the empire. The nomads had taken a similar route as the Mongols and ended up in northern Armenia, when they finally found some proper resistance. But it wasn't Ivan. Instead, it was one of his own bannermen with a local militia he had scraped together. Grigor Kakhbakian defended Ganzak, and after his small force gave them all they were worth, eventually killed and their commanders were captured. The Kipchaks were very much so not above torture, and that's just what they did to the leaders of this resistance. For Grigor himself, who was head of his family, he was dragged naked behind the horses on thorns until he died, and sometime after that. This wasn't done so much as a threat as it was a clear message. The Mongols, like the Huns of antiquity, had created a new age of steppe, a new age of forceful migration, and all the bloodshed that came with such a momentous thing. Ivan did catch up to the Kipchaks, and he did manage to secure at least one victory, but he could not save Grigor Kakhbakian, nor could he save his king any longer, despite half a lifetime's worth of effort. By this point, King George had lingered on for nearly half a year. His wounds were healing, at first, but then infection had set in. Even nearing his deathbed, George was preparing for the eventual return of the Mongols. He needed to rescue the east of his empire. If Shirvan fell, the east was gone. George and his royal entourage left Tbilisi for Baku for a wedding between the Shirvan Shah and King George's own sister. But they only made it as far as Bagavan, Armenia, before he died from infection from his arrow wound, joining Shah Muhammad II of the Khwarezmian Empire on a growing list of monarchs killed by the Mongolian Empire. He passed away exactly 10 years to the day that his mother and the previous monarch of Georgia, Tamar Mepe, had died. I am not making this stuff up. January 18th of 1223. That cannot be a coincidence. But what does it mean? He was the first king of Georgia to die from battlefield wounds, and that certainly was no coincidence either. He joined his greatest ancestors and was buried in Gelati Monastery, carving out his own legacy just as he had always wanted to among these many acclaimed forefathers. Say what you will about King George IV Lascia Bagrationi morally. He was not an evil king, and I'll say it again. He was the bravest man in the room and remained that even when the Mongols themselves were at the gates. His sacrifice and that of the many soldiers that stood beside him were the only thing that kept the sun above Tbilisi bright and radiant, and from a maelstrom of Mongolian arrows. In his lifetime, Lascia kept the Georgian world illuminated. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and join Derek Clark, Savaclio Nazarian, Taj Guildford, Nickmate Vossian, Lazarus Dykos, Dave J, Dalinar, and Moist Lord, or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again, Donald Vincent. What? Why? Nickmate Vossian again, G.O.D, Heath Dion, Carl Brandian, Layla, G.O.K, and John Fritz. Thank you guys for supporting the channel. I appreciate it.